I just want to say, first of all, I don't know if you remember right at the start when Sue was speaking about the impact that child deaths had on our system. And I know that in other countries, for example, I spent a bit of time in Germany last year, and I know that child deaths have had a huge impact there. I'm going to start a bit. This presentation has been prompted a little by a very well-known child death in England, which actually Sue did have a picture of Peter Connelly. Peter Connelly, very briefly, died and there were 3 adults convicted of his death. One was his mother, the other was her boyfriend and the boyfriend's brother. There was a birth father who wasn't resident, who did have contact with the children, who did have contact with Peter, and I do a lot of work around issues around fathers and gender, and there are huge issues around the invisibility of men in that case, in literally the invisibility of the men in the home, who the social workers didn't know were there and who were hidden from the social workers, but also the invisibility of Peter. But I'm not going to talk about those things today. I'm going to talk about something a bit different, because it's not the first case where I've thought, what was going on for that woman? Why was she involved with a man who was so awful, who was so violent and dangerous and so completely cruel to her and to the children and to Peter? And it's not the first time that I've thought that. And I've thought, do we have a language to talk about men and women? Or is our language always about parents and partners, and a language of domestic abuse, which is helpful, but is quite a limited language for what I'm trying to capture, which is something about sexual desire, which is something about vulnerability, something about disappointment, something about hope and loneliness. Now, I'm going to not talk about all those things today, obviously, but what I'm going to try and just open up for you today is, and I don't need to tell this audience this at all, is the importance of language. Already today, Kate's talked about vulnerable families, about the importance of you mentioned family potential as a rallying point for this work. We know that how we describe ourselves and how we are described has huge impacts. I always love when Kate talks about defeated families, because they're families who've been defeated by systems, rather than families who are troubled or troublesome. I'm going to bring in a very simplistic and I'm just mulling it over way, something about what would happen if we started to talk about men and women rather than parents or partners. But first, let me give you some context. Our language in the UK, and I know because I've been looking a little bit across the world, there's massive policy transfer. Our language calls upon parents, and it's within a social investment approach, which is that children are the major impact and the possibility of the future. We need to invest in them because they carry our hopes and they'll ensure our global economic competitiveness. What did Gordon Brown, our much lamented departed Prime Minister, say? We invest in children today because it's maybe 10% of our budget, but they're 100% of our future. So there's kind of investment in children. But there has been consistently over the last 15 years in England a focus on parents as a point, and it's been an instrumental project. They've been called upon in order to realise a project in relation to economic competitiveness and in relation to children. They've not been called upon as people. They've been called upon as conduits, if you like. And I want to say that talking about men and women holds some interesting, it doesn't solve all our problems, nothing does, but it holds some interesting possibilities for supporting a project that starts to get us to think broader. And as people said earlier on, there is a massive family studies literature, a massive sociology literature looking at family flux, looking at all the things that Leonard talked about in relation to different family practices, and Kate mentioned it. There is also a massive sociology literature on what's going on between men and women in contemporary society, how they are or aren't achieving gender equality, how they are or aren't achieving more democratic settlements between each other. And we aren't even engaging in that when we think about the men and women that we end up talking to or not talking to. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about the policy context, a little bit on the literature and intimacy and individualisation and the issues around men and women, and finally some brief stuff on the research on lived experiences. Under New Labour and continuing under the coalition, there was a distinct attempt to position family life as a public rather than a private concern, and all sorts of complex factors involved in this. It wasn't just bad, actually. It was genuinely about trying to support families to marry, work and care. It wasn't all doom and gloom. It wasn't all about control. There were legitimate attempts to support families as well, because prior to that there had been massive neglect of, and there had been massive changes. Women going into the labour force, for example, huge increases in lone mothers, with a very hands-off approach from the state. But there was an attempt, I would say, to conscript parents in the interests of this social investment project under New Labour. A crucial thing that happened, and it was so interesting, the language, every darn policy document talked about parenting as a job. Parenting is probably the hardest job you'll ever do. So,
could you slow down a little bit for the benefit of the international audience?
Well, I'm trying not to get through it, you see.
No.
Sorry. Okay. No, it's the way I always talk. I was just trying to pretend. So parenting was, in every policy document, there was a construction of parenting as a job. It's probably, we were told, the hardest job any of us will ever do. So parenting went from being a relationship, something that was characterised by love and care, or by disappointment or anxiety, to a job that required particular skill and expertise. And indeed, we had the most massive proliferation of experts to help us with this job. Parenting experts of all kinds. And there was a noticeable emphasis on parenting as the difference that made a difference for disadvantaged children. This was new. So, for example, Margaret Hodge, I'm going to be fair and give you a little sliver from all our political parties who were ruling. So Margaret Hodge, who was the Labour First Minister for Children, as far as I remember. Am I right on that? Was she the first? Yeah. We'd never had a Minister for Children before, so a historic appointment. Margaret Hodge said, parenting more than anything else makes a difference to a child's future. This was from a Labour government, and it marked a real shift away from poverty being what made a difference to parenting. Then Nick Clegg, who is the current Deputy Prime Minister, talked about parenting, not poverty, shaping a child's destiny. And I couldn't resist this one for some of the audience, because I know Stephen Scott from the National Academy of Parenting, which has been abolished, thank goodness, but under the cuts, there were some good things to our cuts. They got rid of some of these people. But Stephen Scott wouldn't be one of my favourite people, and he probably wouldn't be one of the favourite people of a lot of people in this room, because he now has decided he knows how to tell social workers how they should be educated. But Stephen Scott argues that poverty is a factor in what happens to children, but it's not a central one. It's the poverty of the parent-child experience that leads to poor outcomes, rather than poverty of a material kind. And you do wonder whether any of these people have ever lived in poverty, because, of course, when you live in poverty, it's all-encompassing. It shapes everything about your day, about the choices you make every single minute of the day, including how you can cope with a child that's driving you crazy, how you can cope with a child that you don't like very much anymore, and how you can cope with the possibility of a different future. Okay, so this is really interesting. Those who were poor were not only expected to cope in the here and now, but they were also expected to equip their children with the skills to move forward in an upwardly mobile project. They were expected to read to their children with support, to read to their children, to help their children, to escape. In fact, to leave them, in fact. And there was an abstract role for fathers in this. This is a gender project, but there was quite a serious, an attempt to engage fathers. The only thing I ever heard a minister or a policy document though talk about what a father might do was read to their children at night. I never heard them say, they could do the washing up, that would be a good role model, or they could clean the toilet, that would be a good role model. Never heard any of that. Am I going a bit slower now? No, darn. How am I doing for time?
We're fine.
Are we fine? Okay, all right, I'll totally slow down then. Okay. Towards the end of the New Labour period of rule, there was a belated apparent understanding of the importance of not just thinking about parenting as something that was unidirectional, either parent to child. And there was a beginning to start to look at parent to parent. And so, for example, Ed Bowles put a lot of money in, he was a minister at the time, a lot of money into something called relationship support. And there was the idea was that you would start to look at the importance of relationship between parents, and it wasn't just relationships between parents who were splitting up or divorcing. Actually, it started to become an area of work that actually just focusing on what parents did or didn't do with their children wasn't always the best, because, you know, for example, if the mother goes to the parenting class and she gets all this great techniques and she goes home and the father says, well, that's a load of old rubbish, I'm not going to do it, then perhaps there might be a problem with that. So they started to think maybe we need to engage with relationships. It wasn't quite as cynical as that. I think there was also a kind of understanding that the relationship between the parents mattered in terms of the overall context in which the child was raised. It was still a child-focused project, but there was an attempt to look at adult relationships. Interestingly, despite the fact that we've had massive cuts, this has continued under the coalition. They've made available £30 million for relationship support services. I think the money is just about to run out in the next year or so, and my understanding is it won't be renewed. So, David Cameron, who's our Prime Minister, he argued the last government concentrated its family support on children, but it also meant they shied away from saying anything meaningful about the family as a whole, and in particular the vital relationships between the family, the ones between parent and child and parent and parent. Again, there was governments always have to slag the previous government off. The previous government had done a lot on parent and child. There hadn't been as much on parent and parent. This was still located within a child-focused project. Okay. What I want to argue is it was a curious project that was aware of change and that kind of referenced the changes that had happened in the last 30 and 40 years in the UK, and that date really from the feminist movement, women going into the workplace, women living on their own, women leaving men, women hoping for more from men getting a bit lost in the process, jobs for men disappearing, working class jobs particularly disappearing, a whole range of really complex things that had happened. This project referenced it but didn't really address it, and actually, funnily enough, I would argue tried to fix men and women into identities around parents and around mothers and fathers. Again, in terms of the research, how did this fit actually with what mothers and fathers themselves thought? Well, this is really interesting and tells us that progress is very complicated, or if there is such a thing as progress. There has been evidence in this country and in the US particularly and in other countries of mothers, despite all the things that have happened and the fact that they are now in the workforce in a massive way, there has been a rise in something called intensive mothering. In mothers investing incredibly in quality time with their children, in being terribly anxious about their children, in feeling that they have to meet particularly their emotional needs, as well as be the school parent, the school champion, and look after them educationally. And there's been a massive expansion of what hitherto had been almost a middle-class project. And that's really interesting because it's almost like mothers themselves, as their lives have got more complex and more open-ended, mothers themselves fixing their identities. So it's really complicated. From fathers, actually, to be fair, there's a lot of evidence that that discourses around fathers have really quite changed, and that younger men in particular, but not just younger men, men from the 40s downwards, are investing much more in what's called the intimate father. Now, this isn't a father who does do his share of the housework, and it's not a father who certainly does a lot of cleaning, but it is a father who thinks that it's important to have a good emotional relationship with his children, and who does think that it's really important that his children listen, it's really important that he listens to his children, rather than that they just listen to him, and that they respect him because they have an emotional connection. It's been called the rise of the intimate father. Okay. So, but what about men and women as partners? This whole thing about intimacy and this whole project that people like Beck Gernsheim have talked about, this project of men and women as kind of individuals charting these life courses that do or don't always mesh together. There's a massive literature and a lot of debate. Anthony Giddens in 1992 wrote a book that has been discussed forever and has been criticised forever, called The Transformation of Intimacy. And he argued that women had pioneered a revolution. And basically, he argued that we'd moved away from a notion of romantic love, which was you meet your one and only love and that's it. You get married and you stay together forever. The women had pioneered move towards what's called confluent love. Confluent love is, well, as long as it's working and as long as we get what we need from each other, particularly emotionally, and as long as we're open to each other, and well, this will work. And linked to that is the notion of the pure relationship. It's a rather cool, rational, well, I'll stick in this as long as it works for me. And he argued that the divorce and separating society was a symptom of this pure relationship and confluent love rather than a cause of it. Now, there are millions of critiques of Giddens. He did no research on this. He just wrote a book about it, you know, as, I was going to say as men do, but I better not say that. As men have tended to do, actually. People like Glenn Jemison said, well, actually what he's describing isn't that new anyway, and there have always been these complicated tendencies around intimacy. Totally disregarded the kind of ways in which men and women get tied together, particularly when they have children, and that it's quite hard to, even if you're not happy, it can be quite hard to move on. And of course, totally disregarded poverty and material inequalities and violence. However, there is no doubt that he was speaking to something, and that has pioneered discussions and research into looked after living apart together families, same-sex families, because he actually argued that same-sex families were the absolute revolutionaries in this respect and that they were pioneering new forms of equality. Okay, going back to the kind of families that we talk about and that seem to end up in troubled families, one of the things that's really interesting that we've done hardly any research on is that in the families who've come to the... do you want me to hurry up?
No.
I will. One of the things that it's really a mystery that why we haven't done more research on this is that you know, every time you look at the kind of families that we're all working with, there's an incredible amount of flux and fluidity. Men and women moving out, usually men actually, and I saw this terrible US phrase for the men being described as free radicals. You know, this kind of like almost, you know, like germs, terrible. But it definitely, you know, when I try and talk about engaging fathers, people quite rightly say to me, well, I'm working with families where there are a number of father figures, or I'm working with families where the children have different father figures or whatever. Lots of flux. But how much do we really know about what's going on? And when we go back to my early point about Peter Connelly, do you know, there wasn't a word, and I'm as bad as anybody else, I was thinking it privately, but I didn't say it publicly. The only discussion there was that even touched on why was Maureen Connelly engaging with this man, what had happened between her and the birth father, blah, blah, blah. The only discussion there was about the dangers of stepfathers, which is a really not a very helpful discussion, actually, because, again, stepfathers are quite a complex category. I won't go on about that, though. So there's a real poor evidence base. What's going on? What do what do women do and feel about such men? I mean, there was an argument after the Giddens study, which said that actually the people who might be more inclined to chase pure relationships and to follow the confluent love project were people who weren't tied together in terms of property, who didn't have a lot to lose. So you could argue, I wouldn't, because we don't know. You could argue that in these families you're seeing the pure relationship. People are just moving on when it doesn't work for them. Of course, we know that it's not as simple as that. When I did research in Sure Start, I found lots of women who were deeply disappointed at the men in their lives. Lots of women who were very lonely and who would have loved a good adult partner. And it's not just simply about domestic abuse. It was also about how they did or didn't engage with their children, how they did or didn't engage with them. There were lots of women who settled for men because it was better than being on their own, especially if they lived in estates where they felt anxious, where they didn't feel safe. But that was, I only got to know that because I was involved with that project for 5 years, and because women talked to me. I don't know, would they talk to a social worker about it, particularly if there were some concerns around their children. The other thing I just wanted to say was, what do we know about what men want for and women want for and from their children? There's a great piece of research by Caroline Hooper who talks about when adults are very poor and feel very stigmatized, which are linked together in our very unequal society, the defensive investments that they can make in their children, in the absence of any other sources of respect or standing, the kind of investments they make in being a good mother, or indeed even in being a mother. And when that can be very tricky if you don't enjoy mothering, if it doesn't work out for you. And where do you get the space to be able to say, actually, this isn't right for me? Middle class women can buy time. They can go off on their spa weekends. They can, me, all of us, we can buy time out with our friends. We can buy space away. The number of times I've said to myself, I throw money at things when I'm short of time. But one of the things recently, in a very small piece of research we did with fathers, and these are fathers who, they were a very small project, but we looked at fathers who were living with their, who had a lot of contact, and fathers who had very little contact with their children. And one of the things we found was that the research seems to suggest that in a context where adult relationships are very unstable and where people don't have strong attachments to class anymore, they don't have strong attachments to, say, trade unions, jobs aren't for life. So where adults feel very unstable, that what they're doing is emotionally investing in their children. Beck and Beck-Gernsheim argue that. What we found actually, interestingly, was for the men, they weren't investing emotionally in the long-term sense in their children. What was really important to them, though, was that their children turned out well, and that they respected them, and that they thought they were good people. So there was an investment, but that was an interesting one, actually. So it wasn't a needy, desperate. But these were older children. Sometimes I think there can be a needy, desperate investment in younger children, which is really challenged as children grow. And I think that's another area we don't know enough about. Okay, there's loads of things we could talk about. From the right, people say, oh, well, the reason that everyone's splitting up is the welfare state makes it possible. These women are just, what incentive do they have to have a man? Feminists would argue it's about domestic abuse. Other people, left-wing people, would say, oh, it's about economic changes, that, what incentive do women have to invest in men when actually men aren't a good bet anymore? They're not a good bet economically. Other people would say it's about attachment difficulties, it's about both sides not being able to attach. And I can't go on to, one of my biggest interests at the moment is around domestic abuse, because I think we've got really stuck in this area. We've got stuck in all sorts of anxiety and orthodoxy. We actually know very little about why men or women, but it's usually men, but not always, why men or women hit each other, what's going on, what are the meanings attached to it, and what are they trying to communicate in these terrible relationships. So I suppose I'm making a plea for more research, really, to be honest, but I think it fits really well into the whole families approach, because it's about really trying to think about different bits of the family, and they're often siloed. Just very, very quickly, a last little anecdote was I was at a really interesting conference on domestic abuse recently, and there were brilliant people talking about the work they were doing around mother and child relationships. There were brilliant people talking about the work they were doing about men, and there were brilliant people talking about work they were doing around the system. None of them worked together. None of them worked in the same places. And what I really feel in terms of domestic abuse, we need a real whole system approach to domestic abuse, and we need a whole family approach to domestic abuse, and we really need to start to tackle some of the anxiety and orthodoxy that's around it. Because the assumption is, particularly, and I am a feminist, but I'm very critical of this, the assumption from feminists is that we already know why men hit women. Well, I don't think we do, actually. I think we have some of the answers, but I don't think we know completely. And I think it'll be very individual in some cases. Okay, thank you.